The night stretched endlessly across the Arizona plains, a sea of whispering sage and moonlit dust. The stars shimmered like cold glass over the desert, and the wind carried the lonely cry of coyotes. Thomas Reed guided his tired horse toward the cabin that stood alone on the ridge, his only company in 3 years of quiet survival. His hands were calloused from work, his heart heavier from memories he rarely dared to revisit. Every nail in the old cabin had been driven by his own hand, every board cut by his sweat. It was his sanctuary, a place untouched by the world's cruelty. But that night, as he pushed open the creaking door, the air felt different. The fire he'd left half dead now burned low and warm. And there, kneeling near the hearth, was a figure, small, motionless, wrapped in shadow. His pulse quickened. He raised his rifle out of instinct, his breath sharp. "Who's there?" he called. The woman turned slowly, her face catching the orange glow. Dark braids framed her high cheekbones, and her eyes, black as obsidian, locked on him without fear. Her dress was torn, her skin streaked with dust, and her breathing shallow. "You lost?" he asked again, his voice low. She shook her head. "No," she whispered, her accent soft, broken but clear. "I was followed. Soldiers came to my camp. I ran." Her words hung heavy in the air, blending with the crackle of the fire. Thomas's eyes darted toward the door, half expecting a patrol to burst in. None came, only silence, that deep, endless desert silence. He hesitated, lowering the rifle, though his heart still hammered in his chest. He studied her for a moment. She couldn't have been more than 22, but her eyes carried the quiet strength of someone who had already seen too much. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but exhaustion. Thomas stepped closer, boots scuffing the dusty floor. "You picked a hell of a place to run to," he muttered, glancing around his small one-room home. A cot, a stove, and a worn Bible on the shelf. He pulled a wool blanket from the bed and tossed it toward her. "Stay till morning," he said. "Then you go your way." She caught the blanket and stared at it for a long moment, as if unsure whether it was a trap or a gift. Finally, she wrapped it around herself and leaned back near the fire. He turned away, setting his rifle down beside the table, trying to ignore the way her presence filled the room. For years, he had lived with nothing but the sound of wind and wood creaking in the night. No voices, no laughter, no heartbeat, but his own. Now there was breathing other than his, and it unsettled him more than danger ever had. The cabin grew quiet again, except for the whisper of flames. He busied himself pretending to tidy up, stacking firewood, checking his saddlebag, anything to keep from staring at her. But when he looked again, she was watching him, her eyes reflecting the firelight like a still pool. "Why you help?" she asked suddenly. The question came out haltingly, yet carried the weight of suspicion. Thomas paused, rubbing the back of his neck. "Didn't say I was helping. Just giving you a place to rest." She didn't look convinced. "White men don't help Apache women," she said, voice soft but steady. He looked away, uncomfortable. "Most don't," he admitted. "But I ain't most." Her gaze didn't waver. It was sharp, not defiant but searching, as if she wanted to see what kind of soul hid behind his calm eyes. Thomas turned toward the door, listening to the wind whistling through the cracks. "You can stay till sunrise," he said again, quieter this time, almost to himself. For a while neither spoke. She leaned her head against the wall, eyes half closed, while he sat on his chair, pretending to read his mother's old Bible. He didn't understand a word of what was happening, only that the emptiness in the room had changed shape. The loneliness that once felt like peace now felt like weight. He couldn't name it, but he could feel it in the rhythm of the fire and the sound of her breathing. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain. Thomas rose to bolt the door just as she stirred again. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I want to stay here," she said, her tone uncertain, not pleading but firm, like a statement of belonging rather than request. Thomas froze. Those words stirred something deep in him, something he'd buried since the day his wife and son were taken by fever 5 winters ago. For years, he'd told himself solitude was safety, that the land didn't betray, that love was a weakness. But now, in that flickering light, with a stranger sitting by his hearth, those beliefs cracked like thin ice. He didn't respond. He couldn't. Instead, he reached for another log, tossed it into the fire, and let the warmth spread through the room. She sat still, her eyes never leaving him. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was alive, pulsing with the fragile beginning of trust. When Thomas finally lay on his cot, the storm outside had begun. Soft rain tapping against the roof, thunder rumbling in the far distance. The fire burned low, and the woman, he didn't even know her name yet, rested near it, wrapped in his blanket, her breathing slow and steady. He turned on his side, staring at the ceiling. He told himself she'd be gone by dawn, that he'd wake up to the same quiet he'd always known. But deep down, he knew the truth. The quiet would never sound the same again. Outside, the desert stretched endless beneath the rain, washing away the tracks of whoever had chased her. Inside, two strangers shared a fragile peace neither could explain. And as Thomas's eyes finally drifted shut, he realized that sometimes the wild doesn't take, it gives. Just not in ways a man expects. The sun climbed slow and steady over the horizon, spilling gold across the rough plains of the Arizona territory. The air was still cool, and a thin ribbon of smoke rose from the small fire Ayanna had built outside the cabin. She moved with quiet purpose, gathering wood, tending the pot, her dark braids swaying as she worked. For the first time in months, Thomas Reed awoke to the smell of coffee instead of dust and loneliness. He stood in the doorway, boots unpolished, shirt half-buttoned, watching her like a man watching a ghost turn real. He cleared his throat. "You're early," he said. She didn't flinch. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder, the faintest curve touching her lips. "The fire doesn't wait," she answered. It was simple, but her tone held something soft, something steady, the kind of strength he'd long forgotten existed. He realized she wasn't afraid to be here. As the morning stretched on, Thomas saddled his horse, pretending to busy himself. But his thoughts kept circling back to her. The way she'd said, "I want to stay here," last night had burned into his mind like the brand on his cattle. He wasn't a man used to company, much less someone like her. Someone hunted. He had buried his wife years ago, and since then lived like a ghost among the living. He didn't know what made him let Ayanna stay, except that something in her eyes made him believe she belonged here, as much as he did. He brought her a loaf of bread and some jerky from his stores. She accepted it with a nod, then spoke softly, "Your land, it's quiet." "No one would find me here," Thomas exhaled. "Quiet can be dangerous," he said. "He lets the past catch up." She looked away at the desert horizon, endless, harsh, but somehow full of promise. That evening, as the shadows stretched long, Thomas returned from the barn to find Ayanna humming. Her voice was low, melodic, ancient. She sat by the fire inside, weaving strips of cloth into a band, colors of red and blue, mixed with small feathers she must have found outside. "What's that?" he asked. "For the wind," she said. "It brings good spirits." Thomas didn't believe in charms, but somehow the sound of her song eased something tight in his chest. He sat near the fire, the warmth brushing his rough hands, and for the first time in years, silence didn't feel heavy. Ayanna glanced at him, her eyes catching the flicker of the flames. "You think I should leave?" she said quietly. He hesitated, staring into the fire. "I think it's safer." "For who?" she asked. The question hung there, daring him to answer. He didn't. Days turned into a strange rhythm. She cooked what little they had, fetched water from the creek, and helped mend fences. He watched her ride bareback on his old mare with the grace of someone born to the land. The soldiers hadn't passed this way in weeks, but Thomas knew the peace couldn't last. Every hoofprint in the dirt made his heart skip. Was it the army or just the wind again? One afternoon, as a dust storm rolled across the plains, Thomas saw her standing in it, arms raised, eyes closed, as if greeting the storm instead of fearing it. He ran out, pulling her back toward the cabin. "Are you crazy?" he shouted over the roar. But she only smiled, wind whipping her hair around her face. "I am alive," she said simply, And in that moment, Thomas realized she wasn't a burden. She was the first sign of life he'd seen in years. When the storm passed, the world smelled of wet earth. Ayanna sat by the fire, drying her hair. Thomas leaned against the wall, watching her quietly. "Tell me," he said at last, "why here? Why me?" She looked up, the firelight painting her face in bronze and gold. "Because you didn't look away," she said. "When I was by the fire that night, you saw me, not what I am, not what others think, just me." He looked down, feeling a heat rise in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "You shouldn't trust a man that easy," she smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but I trust the way this place feels. Like it remembers peace." Thomas swallowed hard. "Peace doesn't last long out here." "Then let it last tonight," she whispered. Morning came clear and cold. Thomas found her outside again, feeding the chickens. Her laughter drifted across the yard, light, effortless, carried by the wind. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed that sound in his home, but his heart was heavy. He knew the soldiers would come eventually. Ayanna's people were being pushed farther each day, and anyone caught helping them was punished. When he approached her, she looked up immediately, reading the tension in his shoulders. "They're coming, aren't they?" she asked. He nodded. Maybe soon." She didn't look afraid. Instead, she said, "Then I will stay until they do." He wanted to argue, to tell her it was madness, but instead he said, "If they take you, I'll ride after you." Her eyes softened. "And if they take you, I'll wait here." That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He watched the fire burn low, the glow flickering against the walls. Ayanna was resting near the hearth, wrapped in a blanket, her breathing steady. The longer he looked at her, the more he felt something unspoken. Not just desire or pity, but belonging. The kind that doesn't ask for words. He turned his gaze to the window, where stars pricked the dark sky. "You'll get us both killed," he muttered under his breath. A soft voice came from the dark. "Then at least we'll die where we belong." She hadn't been asleep after all. Thomas turned toward her, caught between fear and awe. Her words cut straight through him, simple, fierce, and true. He'd spent years avoiding pain, avoiding life. But now, sitting beside her, he realized he'd rather risk everything than go back to being hollow. The next morning, Thomas took an axe and began fixing the broken fence by the pasture. Ayanna joined him, handing him nails and steadying the boards. It felt like they were building more than a fence, like they were anchoring themselves to this small piece of land against the world. By sundown, she brought him water and smiled. "You built this place alone," she said. "Now it stands for two." He looked at her, dust streaking his face, and for once didn't hide his smile. That evening he carved an extra chair from old pine wood, set it by the fire. Then he poured 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her. The wind outside was sharp, but inside the cabin warmth filled every shadow. Ayanna whispered something in her tongue, a prayer, a blessing, then leaned back, eyes half closed. The desert around them stayed wild, cruel, and restless. But the small cabin glowed like a beacon against the endless dark. In the land where everything was taken, land, lives, peace, 2 people had found what even the law couldn't touch. Not ownership, not duty, but something far rarer, a choice made by the heart.